Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Josephine Gray, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in San Francisco. She's originally from New Zealand. She, Josephine, has also for many years been a professional violinist, and she continues to play with various regional orchestras in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she is also on the faculty in the music department of the University of San Francisco. And Josephine and I are going to talk today about how musicians can benefit from the Alexander technique. Josephine, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robert.
Now, I know in talking to you earlier that you were a professional violinist at the time that you discovered the Alexander technique, and I wonder if you could say a bit about how the lessons that you had affected your playing.
Yes, actually, when I first started having trouble, I started getting tendonitis when I was finishing my music performance degree in New Zealand. And there were no Alexander Technique teachers in New Zealand at that time. And I managed to finish my final concert, but it was, I was in a terrible state and a lot of pain. And I actually traveled to the United States shortly afterwards and started having lessons in San Francisco because I'd heard about the technique and I was wanting to address the issues that I had. And I remember very vividly the first lesson, or the first few lessons. I remember my teacher asked me to take up my violin and stand upright, sort of take a normal sort of stance in holding my violin. Mm-hmm. And she showed me in the mirror that what I thought was upright wasn't upright at all, that I was kind of like pushing my pelvis forward and my back was pretty crooked. And this was very interesting. Had no idea. I thought that I was pretty much standing up normally, erect, and then as she worked with me, I realized that what I thought I was doing was completely different to what was actually going on. And from looking in mirrors and also through, working with her, I was really able to address some of the issues that I was having.
Mm-hmm. And could you say a little bit in detail? You said you had tendonitis. You developed tendonitis from
Yes.
playing, and
yeah.
Did that dissipate with the lessons? How did that work out for you?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was an immediate fix. I had a few Alexander lessons and everything magically worked out. I will say that the tendonitis in my arms was related to everything else. So it was how I was standing or sitting, how I was using myself, what was happening in my neck, what was happening in my knees. So one thing about the Alexander technique is that it's very holistic. If a musician is having problems like tendonitis or problems in their hand, then Western medicine will probably, take an X-ray of the hand and the arm and look at the symptoms, whereas an Alexander technique teacher would look at the whole picture and look at how the back and the neck and the coordination of the whole body, because the extremities, the fingers, are really, and the use of how they function is a result of the entire structure, how the whole body and mind is, really. So, and I would say that the Alexander technique, rather than dealing with symptoms, overcoming pain, we would always, when I'm working with a musician, the first thing I would do would be to have them play for me so that I can see really what we're dealing with, and rather than look at at healing the symptoms, I would look at the cause, why the tendonitis is happening in the first place. And that's because if someone actually does get out of pain and the tendonitis subsides and they feel all right, or again, when they go back to playing, if they haven't changed what they were doing in the first place, it's just going to reoccur and become chronic. So specifically, I worked on a lot of different issues that were to do with my general use. And originally, I thought that playing the violin was what caused the tendonitis. But I soon discovered that everything I did, from vacuuming to shampooing my hair to, opening a door, that I used an inappropriate amount of muscular tension. And I was really going at everything with far too much work, and that I needed to really address all of the activities in my life, not just the violin playing.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you bring out is that when anyone comes for a lesson, but we're talking today about musicians, if you have, let's say, wrist pain or pain in your arms, there's a tendency to think that the problem is in the wrist or the arms,
Mm-hmm.
whereas that really is where the symptom is manifesting at that time, but it's very likely, almost always, a much broader issue than that, a tendency to tighten or stiffen or overdo generally, and the pain or discomfort tends to occur at the weak link in the system. And for one person, it might be their wrist. For someone else, it could be their shoulder. But to identify the problem with the location is not the way Alexander technique teachers look at things, I guess you could say.
Yes, and I'd also say in the case of a singer or an actor, um, if they're really tensing in their ankles, for example, that tension will be exhibited or manifested in their sound.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
Well,
yeah,
for a musician as well, really, any
absolutely.
tension not only can produce pain and discomfort and end careers, but even if it doesn't rise to that level, any excess tension is gonna lessen the quality of the sound being produced, whether it's with an instrument or with your voice.
I would like to point out, Robert, though, that the key word there is excessive tension,
Yes,
because
yes.
we need tension. Everybody thinks that, oh, if I could only be more relaxed when I played, or, but really, we're not jellyfish. We're not meant to be these sort of blobs on the floor. We actually function by using appropriate amounts of muscular tension. So tension itself is not this bogeyman that we have to eradicate from our bodies. We would be nothing at all. We wouldn't be able to sit in a chair without muscular work, which is basically tension. Yeah.
Right. So yes. What we're really helping people is to acquire is the appropriate amount of, we could call it tension, or appropriate amount of work for the particular situation at hand.
Yes.
So obviously, at some point, you were t- uh, sufficiently taken by the technique that you enrolled in a 3-year teacher training course,
Yes.
and of course now you're primarily, I assume, an Alexander technique teacher, even though you continue to play. When you work with me, maybe what would be interesting to a musician would be the question, if I as a musician came to you for a lesson,
Hmm.
what might I expect initially? I come in, you may have asked me to bring my instrument, or if I'm a singer, I brought some music with me. What's going to happen in the lesson?
So, the first thing is people always want to know this. You will be fully clothed throughout the whole lesson, although some of the lesson we will be working on a massage table, but at no point will you need to undress. So, and I would start, yes, I would like the person to bring their instrument the first lesson because I would like to be informed from the start as to what they look like, what's actually happening as they play or sing. I would then say that we won't deal with the instrument or do any singing for quite a number of lessons because I would need to really teach the basics of the technique before we then try and apply it to something fairly complex as playing an instrument or singing.
Hmm.
And then the nuts and bolts of the technique really, as I mentioned before in my first lessons, I was helped to understand that my picture, my awareness really was unreliable. And I guess through the use of mirrors, but also by putting hands on, I would start to show the student, have them become aware of what they're doing, basically. By putting their hand on their neck, I can possibly show them what kind of tension is happening there, especially if they're moving in and out of a chair or walking, or then we could possibly look at, in general, it's being made aware of what you're doing, because if you're blissfully unaware, it's very hard to make any changes or choices. Once you start to become more aware of what you're doing, the Alexander process involves inhibiting or stopping that habitual habit, that habitual response to, it might be answering the phone or getting out of a chair or playing an instrument. And then giving what Alexander called his directions. So we're essentially replacing habits, faulty postural habits, with more beneficial ones. We're actually consciously deciding that in order to get out of a chair, hey, it might be a little bit better to not grip and tighten and pull your head back.
Hmm.
So it's very hard to talk about the technique. It's a little bit like trying to teach someone to drive the car, drive a car in a classroom. You can talk till you're blue in the face, but until they're actually behind the wheel and pressing the pedals down and dealing with the gear lever, it's a little it's a little hard to explain. But basically, part of the lesson would also be, as I mentioned before, on the massage table, the student would be, I would show the student how to essentially do homework, which is what we call constructive rest. It's a lying on a hard surface, even either a table or the floor, with some books under your head, and basically showing your nervous system, giving your nervous system an Alexander lesson by showing it that it can really do without a lot of excessive tension in the body. So I really, from the first lesson, would show the student how they can, quote unquote, work on themselves at home so that they can actually be making progress, and in between the weekly lesson or the bi-weekly lesson. So some of it would be on the massage table.
So a musician listening to this might think, well, she's saying that I don't know, I don't have accurate information about what I'm doing. But now supposing a musician were to say to you, let's just take a violinist as an example, I know I'm tightening my shoulders and I can feel pressure I can feel pain in my shoulders and arms, so I know I'm tightening them. Why would you tell me that I have inaccurate sensory awareness? I know what I'm doing. I just have to figure out a way to improve things.
Well, it's not that I would tell them. I would perhaps show them. For example, yeah, they might be aware that there's pain in the shoulder because they're tensing the shoulder, but they might not be aware that that's caused essentially by tension in the head-neck joint.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So pain is a very useful thing in the sense because it brings our attention to that area and it shows us, pretty quickly, gives us information about misuse, but it also takes the attention away from everything else. So in a way, it's not like a big judgment thing, I'm going to tell you where you're going wrong and look at this. It's more just a playful exploration of what we're doing and how we can possibly do things that are more beneficial. I think that, if we go into taking Alexander lessons and think that we can somehow eradicate all our postural habits and eradicate all our problems, I think that's not really correct. I think we'll probably take our habits to the grave. But the more familiar we are with what we do, then we can make proactive choices about whether we actually do them or not, And
that's really, I think that's really what the Alexander technique shows people, that it gives them choices. It doesn't ever force someone to play or stand or sit or move differently. But it gives them some options to explore. Mm-hmm. And most people, at least in my experience of teaching, are pretty quick to recognize that some of the new ways of moving with less tension certainly feel a lot nicer and lessen the pain and enable the person to do whatever they're doing, including playing an instrument or singing, a lot better. But,
yeah, exactly.
But we're not in the business of telling people how to play, for example, or what to play. Or we're more interested in whatever you want to do. We want to see if there are ways that you could do it with greater ease.
Exactly.
And I raised this question actually with another teacher in an interview, but I think it might be worth getting your perspective on this. Of all the areas, all of performing arts areas, the technique is probably best known among musicians. And yet, I've certainly run into, and I'm guessing you have, musicians who have some very strange ideas about what Alexander teachers would ask them to do, and in particular, you sometimes hear, well, an Alexander technique teacher is going to somehow interfere with my musical playing technique that I've spent all these years learning. Or another thing I've heard sometimes is they're going to take all the passion out of the playing. It's going to be uh, just so relaxed that sure I won't be in pain, but I won't be producing anything very interesting either. Could you comment on those, and maybe there's some others that you've encountered in your teaching?
Yes, absolutely. Firstly, I totally agree that, once you've been playing for 30 years, it's very hard to confront the possibility that you might have to, go back to doing long bows or unpick your technique. But having said that, for example, I worked with a violist recently, and she'd been really having a lot of pain and difficulty, and we looked at the choices that she'd made with her shoulder rest. And I noticed that I noticed that when she actually took the instrument up and put her chin, put her viola in position, that she almost had a sort of vice grip relationship between her chin. When her head dropped on the instrument, it was almost like a sort of a gripping action. And I also noticed that because of the physical shape of the shoulder rest, that her head needed to sort of come forward in order to position, in order to sort of keep the shoulder rest in place. I know it's hard to sort of describe this, but and we worked a lot on this, and we discovered that, in fact, it was probably the shoulder rest that was causing a lot of the issues, and
so that's a relatively easy fix, isn't it?
Well, it is. It may be. Yeah, I mean, it's not so easy to give up something that you've been used to using for 30 years. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand,
it's a lot easier than having severe neck pain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another example, for example, I had a student that had this brand new pair of glasses, and he was very proud. He told me, I just spent, $300 on these, and they were very, they were kind of narrow frames, they weren't big. And I noticed that in order to sort of get the sweet spot, like sort of to look through the glasses at the right, to really see well, he was actually kind of tensing in his neck.
Right.
And, that's just an example that we are messing with a priceless piece of machinery, the head and neck joint, in order to accommodate a $200 or $300 pair of glasses.
Right. Yeah.
To stop them from slipping down our nose, or it's incredible what we do in order to accommodate ourselves towards an instrument, instead of thinking of the instrument as just a piece of wood and it's nothing without us, really.
And we're really the more important of the two instruments.
Absolutely. In fact, just to come to one of my basic points that I bring up when dealing with a musician, your mind and body is your primary instrument. And many of us have these very expensive instruments, and we look after them and put them away in their case and treat them very well, and we've invested a lot in them. And then look what we do to our primary instrument. We slouch and throw ourselves on the couch and we don't treat our primary instrument as well, and we also don't think about tuning it and priming it in order to use it. When we get out on stage, we carefully tune our instrument and make sure it's working correctly, but we don't think of our mind and body as the primary instrument.
Yes, I see that a lot with the musicians that I work with. There's a kind of intensity about the playing and about the music and the instrument, but but with an almost lack of concern about their own bodies until and unless
Something goes,
something
yeah,
goes
it's
awry
wrong. Yeah.
in an obvious way. And when you just now said something, it kind of prompted a thought in my mind. Before a concert, the musicians on stage are tuning their instruments. We're all familiar with that. And really, if they would take a split second or two to look after their own instrument themselves, and the Alexander technique provides you with exactly that ability to just very easily and softly come back to yourself and notice what's going on at some key parts of your body, perhaps, and making really simple, quick changes that take a lot less time than tuning a violin.
Mm. Yes, I mean, over the years, working in theatres, and if you think about it, actors and dancers and singers will arrive at the theatre hours before and do warm-up exercises. I mean, they wouldn't dream of turning up 20 minutes before and just warming up their instrument, which is what musicians generally do. You never see musicians stretching. You rarely see musicians maybe doing physical warm-ups. They just sort of turn up at the last minute and get their instrument out. So, but I really, having said that, I don't want to suggest that, musicians are somehow, that it's their fault that they get problems, but I would really like to point out that I've found various physical activities like swimming and going to the gym as being really essential to my violin playing. And but that when I swim and when I exercise, I'm really thinking of my Alexander work, because I'm not just sort of mindlessly going to the gym and lifting things up.
I think that point that you made just now, I'd like to maybe expand on it, that certainly it's not musicians' fault that they often do experience pain. There's a pretty high level of pain, I think, overall among professional musicians. I think a survey showed that over 80% played in pain at least some of the time. But I think it's really a lot of it is that even musicians themselves may not realize just how profound the demands they're making on their physical body are. That playing for many hours a day, which typically involves repeating the same basic movements over and over again, is an extraordinary thing to undertake. And you're putting demands on your body that are really unlike pretty much any other profession or many other professions. And you need all the edge you can get in terms of being able to pull that off well. And I think the Alexander technique, in terms of providing extra edge, so to speak, would be right up at the top for things for musicians to consider.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Yeah.
I think my response to having pain and having tendinitis was to just give up the violin. Okay, I'm
Right.
just going to give up. If I don't play, then I won't have to be in pain. Um, and many musicians do give up. They just think, oh, I'm not cut out for this. I can't put these demands on my body or my physique. But to a certain extent, I don't think that's. I don't really think that we are not of a evolved enough structure to be able to do anything. I think that our bodies and our minds have unlimited capacity, and that it's really, if you think of typing or driving or even riding a bicycle, I mean, they all involve particular skills, and most of us do those things. We learn to ride a bicycle and we can do it for the rest of our lives. But I certainly remember when I first went out with my bicycle. I don't know if you remember those
Oh yeah.
training wheels,
Yep.
training wheels. And I
Yes.
remember just saying to my father, you're never taking those training wheels off, because I'm never going to get this. I'm never going to be able to balance on two wheels, steer, push the pedals, you know, not fall off. I mean, the process completely floundered me, and I just thought that I was never going to actually be able to do that. And yet, yeah, that's a skill set that we can actually achieve, years later. And back to this question, I don't think that it's necessarily this unobtainable, the demands. I think that our bodies are pretty incredible, and that there's no reason why we can't play repetitively for, 8 hours a day if we can find a way to do it with more ease, with less strain. I think it's totally
Oh,
possible.
I agree
Yeah,
with that.
yeah,
The
yeah,
the key word there though is the if, and
yeah.
I guess what I would say is that um, a really good way to learn how to play without excessive strain is to take some Alexander lessons.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
let me ask you a question on that general topic. Of course, you are a professional musician as well as being an Alexander Technique teacher. But for a musician listening to this, how important, if at all, do you think it is for them, if they are going to have Alexander lessons, to have them with a teacher who also has a background in music?
Well, I have a lot of musicians who are my students. I guess they look at my website, they are aware of the fact that I used to be, that I overcame my problems and managed to, play professionally now without being affected by tendinitis, and so they come to me. But I definitely wouldn't think that that's an essential element. Some violinists and violists are happier maybe working with another violinist because of the sort of intricate details, shoulder rests, but I really had some fantastic Alexander lessons with teachers who were not musicians. And so I think it's could be a benefit, but it's not necessarily one.
Right.
So
So I guess the takeaway message is if you're looking for an Alexander teacher, especially if there's only one in your area, don't have lessons even if that person's not a musician, because it's a
absolutely,
very good
yeah,
chance they can help you. And that
yeah.
certainly, I mean, in my case, I am not just not a musician, but I am about as unmusical as it's possible to be. I'm kind of famous for that, and yet I work a lot with musicians, and I always am very upfront with them, and in saying, for example, in terms of judging the say the improved tone of your playing with Alexander, I'm probably not someone you want to count on to give you accurate feedback. Although sometimes I am able to hear the difference, but
Hmm.
you need to do some of that experimenting around someone with a good musical ear. But I work with all kinds of musicians, and I've never personally felt that not being a musician has been any kind of a major drawback. And in some ways, I almost feel like it's an advantage in that I can look at the whole playing process kind of as an outsider without any prejudgment about
Hmm.
what what the player should look like while they're holding their instrument, for example.
Just coming back to this point that you made about musicians playing in pain.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that I wanted to mention was that when I first started having problems, um, the pain would come, or I would notice the pain after the performance. So I'd be in excruciating pain afterwards. And sometimes it would happen during, but one thing that I think is true is that musicians will continue playing, or they won't even really notice what's happening until after the piece is finished.
Yeah.
It's maybe they're sort of in denial a little bit. They know they have to get through it, and they notice it afterwards when they've actually, done the damage, as it were.
Hmm. And
And
I think that
yeah,
partly that's a result of some musical training programs that where there's almost an idea that you have to play through the pain.
yeah,
And
and
I think
so
that's not such
yeah,
a great idea,
well,
obviously, as an Alexander teacher.
yeah.
My sense would be if you're starting to get pain, even if it's not a lot, that would be the time, or even before then, ideally, to start looking at your process of playing. Because if you're
So
getting a
yeah,
little pain
yeah.
today, next year it might be a lot worse.
So my process in that is I noticed that the more Alexander lessons that I had, the more able I was to notice what I was doing, not only as I was doing it, but even before.
Hmm.
So,
Right, right.
as a musicians know, there's when you're playing a piece, there's some parts of the pieces that are easier than others or harder, and we can begin to notice what we do in reaction to, oh, that nasty little bit's coming up.
Hmm.
And if we can really change our reaction or our habit to that particular passage coming up, prepare for it, and make choices about how we approach it, then we can really become aware of what we're doing before the damage is done.
Yes,
And
exactly. And that
we'll
can be done while you're on stage,
absolutely.
even while you're playing, and certainly while you're pausing. I mean,
And I,
the
yeah,
opportunities are there, And I think that's a really good point, that especially after you've had a few lessons and you're familiar with the whole process, you can constructively intervene in the situation very quickly and very simply and very lightly. It doesn't have to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes musicians think, oh, well, it's all very well thinking about my Alexander, but how am I ever going to apply this to, playing something? And I thought that as well. I thought that for many years it would be impossible to apply the technique to my playing because it was so complex and you're thinking of so many things and how could you possibly be thinking of your back while you're playing some piece from memory. But another aspect I'd really like to bring up is the fact that one of my major problems was, as a string player, was holding my breath. And when I played, especially if I played a piece from memory, I would in fact hold my breath, and it was almost at the end of the piece, I'd feel like I was drowning.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure that my on an unconscious level, I thought that if I breathed normally, I might forget the next phrase. So holding my breath was a way of kind of keeping my concentration or, not losing it.
Mm-hmm. And
And
I'm going to guess that before you took Alexander lessons, you weren't aware of that pattern.
well, I was aware that I felt like I drowned
Right, but
at
you
the
weren't
end of the
aware,
playing.
but
But
I'm betting that you weren't aware of that specific pattern that you mentioned. You
yeah,
were aware of the result of it for sure.
yes. And obviously, wind players and brass players, they're using their breath to make the sound. But string players and pianists and guitarists, I've noticed anyway that we all interfere with our breath when we play. It's part of a very habitual response to life that when we want to execute something very fine, it might even be shaving or putting on makeup or, you know, doing something fiddly like screwing in a screw, or, we tend to interfere with our normal breathing. And although I won't say that Alexander has any specific breathing exercises, but learning the technique will really and indirectly improve your breathing. The other thing that I wanted to mention is having very high expectations about getting out of pain or healing. I don't think I hope that there aren't any Alexander technique teachers who will say, come to me, have lessons, and you will never have pain again. When a musician comes to my door, I would actually say to them, it's quite likely that you will have flare-ups for the rest of your career, as I do. But realistically, what we can hope for is that the severity or the intensity of the flare-ups is lessened, that they last a shorter period, and that they are more infrequent. And that, as a really realistic objective, is much more, it's much better than thinking that, if you come along and take these lessons, you will never have pain again. I sometimes have flare-ups. I'm not perfect. I have to really, really take care of myself, and I think that my arms are very susceptible to flare-ups, and I have to be careful. I have to think a lot about the way I carry things, about the way I do things. I mean, it's nowhere near as debilitating as it was, many years ago when I first started having lessons. But I think it's unrealistic to think that you will somehow, never have pain again, or, you
Hmm.
know,
Well, I think in essence, the Alexander technique is about making improvements, not necessarily about reaching perfection.
yeah,
I
exactly.
think that's, Alexander teachers are not gods, or even teachers who've been teaching for many, many years um, can still have aches
Look,
and pains too. I
but
mean, we're
but
not.
also they're still learning.
We're
I don't think,
always learning. Yes,
yeah, I don't
absolutely.
think we ever become a master. And some people consider that, a little frightening. Well, you've been teaching for 40 years, aren't you a master yet? Well, I learn as much from my students as they learn from me, and I think I hope that I never stop learning. I hope that I never reach, that well, I know that I'll never have perfect use or but as long as I can play without pain, I'm very happy, and I'm very happy to be able to help musicians avoid what I went through early in my career.
So, Josephine, is there anything else you'd like to add? I think we're kind of coming towards the end of our talk. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to bring out?
Um, I don't think so, Robert. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I I would say though that if that the Alexander technique is not only for people in pain. I think you touched on this before that we have this attitude that if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Well, there is so much that you can do. There is so much that you can do on a preventative level,
Yes,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
waiting until you're in severe pain, with debilitating tendonitis, it's really not going to be. Of course, that's when a lot of people come to us, but um, it's very beneficial for anyone, whether they're a musician or an athlete or just want to be able to run with their grandchildren, in their retirement. Um, you don't have to be in pain
And
in
you don't
order to
have to be a
benefit.
performer of any kind, a musician or any other kind. I mean, many
Yeah,
Alexander students are people with office jobs or whatever. It's not. We work with all kinds of people. But your
yeah,
point about uh, call it preventative, looking after yourself, I think that's the reason why uh, really the top music schools in the world, certainly in the States, Juilliard and many of the top universities, and in England, the top music academies there all have Alexander teachers on staff. I couldn't imagine a really top school that would not provide at least the opportunity for their students to have some exposure to the technique. And of course now the University of San Francisco music department is in that category with you being on the staff there.
absolutely. Yes, it's they've just extended their program to include music
Right.
majors, and they've employed me as their first Alexander Technique teacher.
Right.
So
So
I'm thrilled to be able to give back to my profession, and
so maybe this would be a good place to end the conversation. We'll just say that if you are a musician, whether you're playing in pain or not, if you want to improve the quality of your playing or lessen the discomfort if you are in pain, uh, checking out the Alexander technique might be a pretty logical thing for you to do. And of
absolutely.
course, if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, Josephine Gray is a teacher there, and we will put a link to her website next to the interview. So I think with that, I think we've pretty much covered what we needed to cover. Josephine, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Robert.